Is it like too far? Too?
No, super close. Echo Park. Our office is 2 blocks from my home. So
you walk to work?
No, because it's Los Angeles, and because basically every day I'm driving around the town like a madman. It sounds much more luxurious than it is in practice, but I do make a point. It's nice at the end of the day that I don't have a...
Where's your office located?
1932 Echo Park Avenue.
Oh, you guys are in Echo Park. That's right. Yeah,
on the boulevard. It's actually Peter Shire. Do you know him? He's kind of L.A. famous, Echo Park famous artist, and it's one of his old studios. So there's like this old sign on it. It's like a little industrial building that's about 1,000 square feet.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Have you guys? Wait, how long has your office been around?
About, I think, 5.5 years. LinkedIn tells me
every
once in a while. I'm like, oh.
Right.
Actually, it's not. It's LegalZoom, actually. Okay. We started the office about 5.5 years ago. And should I jump into the origin story?
Yeah, let's do
it.
Yeah.
I was living in the Bay Area, working at a landscape architecture office, and my then girlfriend, now wife, was basically like, let's move. I'm from Southern California. She's from Southern California. She said, let's move back to Los Angeles. And I said, that sounds great. And so then in a thoroughly, not fully figured out sort of a way, I moved here, and my business partner, Alan, was not going to move to the Bay Area. Was not going to leave the Bay Area.
Right.
So we started a business in 2 places at the same time, which kind of made no sense. But then early years, I was driving up to the Bay Area constantly, and then Alan was coming down constantly. And then as our offices have grown and we've kind of become more established, I go up there maybe once a month. He comes down maybe every other month. We're increasingly kind of independent, though I would say very much still in psychic alignment. So it's and it's nice to practice in 2 places. Kind of.
Yeah, for sure. And once a month is not too bad. Right?
No, not at all. Yeah.
I was wondering why San Francisco and LA, because plant-wise, it's really different. Right?
It is different, but it's actually horticulturally, there's a lot of overlap, but it is definitely hotter and drier here. But I don't know. It wasn't like I have no deep philosophy as to why we did that, but I do have to say, with Dropbox and clear communication, it's not that complicated.
Yeah.
Really?
And it, in a way, it earlier, I think it kind of brought on notoriety that we may not have had otherwise, even though it was just Alan in a room and me in a room here. Mm-hmm. But and it's nice to practice it in both places because, as you guys know, I've heard you kind of talking about this distinctions between Southern California and Northern California. They're very different.
Yeah.
And it was interesting starting a business here, not having really any network other than kind of family, but that wasn't really helpful. No offense to my parents, but
if they can give you clients, it's helpful.
Yeah, exactly. But I would say that the level of craftsmanship in the Bay Area tends to be much higher.
Really?
Yeah, and it's been interesting here. It took us a while to get our bearings and to get our craft and kind of actually work with contractors to get them to build in the way they wanted to. There's more of a culture for landscape architecture in the Bay Area.
Really?
Really?
It's kind of I think the presence of Berkeley for decades and decades and decades kind of feeds into that, and there's just a lot of landscape architecture offices there, and there's not that many here. It's a very different landscape, pardon the pun, in these 2 places. So, yeah.
I would have thought the inverse because, for landscape architecture, people want to be outside, and it's colder in the Bay Area, and down here you can pretty much be outside more or less every day of the year, and there's the kind of threshold between inside and outside gets pushed back and forth or blurred much more. So I would have thought that landscape architecture in Southern California would be much more, prominent.
Yeah, it's counterintuitively. I've found it's not the case, though. I'd like to think we're contributing to changing that.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think it is changing. I think there's a lot of emerging talent in Southern California now, but when you get out of school in the Bay, there's many offices of all kind of scales, types, personalities. And here there's some, Meier and Reyes Clementi Hale. There's some like bigger, more kind of corporate offices. But it was kind of wide open for a small, sophisticated office, which is kind of what I wanted to create with the office here.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So you're from Southern California originally. Whereabouts?
Tustin, Orange
Tustin?
County.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm from Orange County as well.
Oh, where are you from?
Orange.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I always
You're
like,
the
you know
cute little-
Orange.
Yeah, of course. The Orange Circle.
Yes, exactly.
Growing up, I don't know if it was still there when you were growing up, but Green Records was there was a little punk rock record shop that was like Mecca. And it was in the Orange Circle, and that's where I would like not eat lunch, save the money that my mom gave me for lunch, and then go buy like the.
I've definitely
new
walked by it. I don't know if they're
Crenshaw.
around there anymore. Have you been to the Circle recently?
Not in a minute.
It's changed a lot. I mean,
okay.
not necessarily for the worse, but back in that time, it was all antique shops, like the kind of oddball record shop, and
Yeah.
that's
Hot
kind
skates?
of it. And and now it's become, and then so for a period of time it kind of died because there wasn't a lot of people going to that area.
Okay.
Really. So now there's like a lot of restaurants, a lot of bars.
Cool.
So it's become more activated, but that also means that as a consequence,
Change.
some of those antique shops have kind of gone away.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting spot.
Yeah, it's a good spot.
That's funny, Orange. Because whenever I tell people I'm from Orange, you're like, what do you mean Orange? Like Orange in Orange County.
Tustin.
And then you went up to Northern California for your bachelor degree, or
No. Idyllic childhood in Orange County on a cul-de-sac skateboarding. It was great.
skateboarding?
Yeah.
That sounds like me minus the skateboarding. I tried to skateboard. It didn't work.
It's hard. Skateboarding's hard. And then I undergraduate degree in the history of art and architecture from UC Santa Barbara.
Oh, cool.
So I was there for 4 years. Did a year abroad in Italy over the course of that, and then
It's a fun school.
It's a great school. And moved to Los Angeles, lived in Silver Lake. I was from probably like 23 to 27-ish. And then worked for American Apparel when they were kind of exploding. Exploding in a good way before they exploded in a bad way. And simply because I could use a drill and worked hard, they like flew me around the world opening stores. It was a great job.
So what was your position?
I worked in the
with
art
them?
department,
Okay.
but it was kind of retail visuals, jack of all trades sort of a thing.
Really?
Yeah.
That's pretty big. That's a pretty big jump from art history, architecture, and art history. Is what you said?
Yeah. Well, I basically got a job at a gallery and then realized I didn't want a job at a gallery. It was one of these vague undergraduate degrees where I had no idea how it would apply, and it didn't really at that time for anything for me, like meaningfully. And I had never grown up doing construction. It just wasn't something that my father did. And at American Apparel, I learned about this thing called construction, which is magic.
At American Apparel.
Yeah, totally. And you can tear down a wall. And,
Yeah.
that was fascinating to me. It was very exotic, actually. And so I just basically learned that and then opened stores for about 3 or 4 years and then went to school in the Bay Area kind of on a whim. I knew my future wasn't long at American Apparel, per se, and I had always gardened. And my mom, thanks Mom, was basically like, have you thought about landscape architecture? And so I just liked it, had a good ring to it.
Yeah.
And I applied to Cal and I got in, but I showed up at school like not knowing anything about the profession, it was kind of a very ill-informed decision that has serendipitously worked out quite wonderfully.
That's a big move, though, because one, to get into Cal Berkeley, which is a really tough place to get into, and it's a tenacious environment, as you know, and then to go into a profession that, I mean, I guess in retrospect seems like the kind of blending or the intersection of the construction interests and also the gardening, but at that time, as you were saying, you didn't really quite understand what it was.
I read there was like a suggested reading list for potential MLA students website for the Cal, and I read this book, Michael Huff, I believe is how you say it, and he was a Canadian, I think ecologist or scientist, and he wrote this book called Urban Form and Natural Process, and I somehow ended up with it, and in it he kind of lays out this really powerful eloquent, science-based argument in which he states like the way we are landscaping, like as a Western civilization, is fundamentally wrong, and here's why. And he kind of comes to this research through studying kind of vacant lots and derelict spaces in Toronto, actually, and noticing that those sorts of spaces are actually the only spaces that anything like ecologically robust is actually happening.
Mm-hmm.
So he kind of lays out this really powerful, beautiful argument that says like the way we put shrubbery, the way we like landscape as kind of like a post-war kind of civilization, which is kind of the idiom we're still stuck in. He kind of says that's wrong, and I was just like blown away. And so that was kind of a moment where it clicked, and I was like, oh, I got to do this thing.
Right. Right.
So, yeah. So it was a little research.
Yeah. So, and then the Masters in Landscape Architecture, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Is a two-year program?
3-year
program.
3 agonizing
3.
years. Yeah. You guys are architects?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm actually quite curious about the profession and the education and everything about it because, starting in undergrad, let's say, I went to Cal Poly SLO.
Oh, so did my business partner, Alan.
Oh, yeah?
Yep, he's a SLO guy.
And I think I read that, yeah. And so in the architecture program, oddly, there's no crossover between the architecture program and landscape architecture or even, they have an urban city and regional planning program. There's no crossover between any of them. And I don't know what it was like at Berkeley. So I think that's interesting. But then also, from kind of the architects or outsiders' perspective, looking at the landscape students, they were always doing these really big, colorful, hand-drawn with colored pencil things. You're like, what are you guys doing? Like, this is so weird. Like, we're over here making stuff out of CNC machines and things like this.
Yeah. Pedagogically, the architecture and landscape architecture departments were very different and distinct at Cal. There's overlap between regional planners and environmental planners and city planners with landscape. And I think historically, like in the 70s and 80s and 90s, a lot of like landscape architecture offices essentially became kind of planning scale offices. This was the years of like EDA and SWA and things like that. And so I think there came a moment where those professions kind of overlapped. And I think that now they're kind of
splitting?
Yeah, kind of splitting up in a way again. I don't know pedagogically why. But what I did one thing at Cal, and I actually took a fair number of architecture classes.
Really?
Because I was interested. And also the theoretical component at Cal was a little bit thin. Actually, that's a little bit too harsh. I had a great theory class, but I really wanted to understand architectural theory, so I took this class, which was essentially an architectural theory class, which I thought was awesome. I didn't want to like leave school and not understand what postmodernism meant as it relates to architecture, and you could very easily do that, get an MLA and like not understand architectural theory.
Sure.
Simply because I wanted to be able to talk to architects.
Well, it seems like 3 years is at once a long time, but also pretty short to cram in that amount of information. So I wouldn't imagine there's a whole lot of time or space in the curricula to kind of be looking at architectural history or theory and other things if you're trying to learn everything but you can about landscape architecture.
Yeah, electives. So I use my electives to kind of sneak into the architecture.
Right. So there, you did have a theory course in landscape architecture. What is that about exactly? Because in architectural theory, it's a lot of times focuses on the evolution of basically buildings, right, and their kind of philosophical or social meanings, and is it the same thing but just for landscape? Is it a broader kind of scope of the world?
It's more confusing, actually. It's like even less linear, because I would say historically at times landscape architecture has, in regards to its theory, kind of like siphoned onto what architecture is up to and kind of followed that. Like, for example, modernism in architecture happened, and I think it was at Harvard, for example, the architecture department started teaching kind of architecture through like the lens of modernism. That wasn't happening in landscape architecture until like a group of students. I'm going to mangle landscape architectural history right now, so please fact check everything that I say. But a group of students, Dan Kiley being kind of like the figurehead, kind of pointed and said, hey, we want to do that. We don't want to design gardens in the Beaux-Arts style anymore. And so then landscape architecture then started incorporating elements formally more modern, being alleys of trees and kind of rectilinear like kind of geometries and things like that. I've kind of always like questioned not the sincerity of that, but given that I feel like modernism, as the way like Corbusier kind of postulated it, was a strategy. I kind of sometimes question that landscape architecture adopting the formal language of modernism isn't necessarily in and of itself like a philosophical, like realignment. So I have this weird theory in my mind that like modernism hasn't necessarily happened in landscape architecture, or that modern movement never happened with as much like authority in landscape architecture as it did in architecture. But that's my own weird conspiracy theory, which isn't like necessarily true. It's just a thing. And then what's happened is things have gotten really complicated. There was a postmodern movement in landscape architecture, kind of largely led by Peter Walker and Partners, a Bay Area firm. And then when I was in school, there was this thing called landscape urbanism. Have you heard of it?
I have, yeah.
It's largely out of kind of Penn and Harvard, Waldheim, and kind of like these big intellectual like giants. But it's and I don't mean to be pejorative, but I will be a little bit. I think it's a hyper complex, really complicated approach to like kind of landscape architecture and discourse that I still don't fully understand, and I think in a way it's set our profession back a little bit in that I'm a big believer in like everyday theory, or like theory that I can kind of talk to my mom about, because the moment a thing gets shrouded in like really esoteric language, I feel like it becomes cut off from the regular population. And so there's this weird thing we kept trying to learn in school, like this landscape urbanism thing, and it like never really like sat well with me. I was like, what is this?
Wait, what is it? Because I remember reading it, but I don't remember it.
Yeah, you should. It would be an interesting thing to ask landscape architects what it is, because I don't think most of them could explain it to you. And I think therein lies a problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, but I think now there's new buzzy words, ecological, urbanism, these things. But I think it's kind of a moment of like distillation, maybe, in landscape architecture. I couldn't tell you what like the reigning ethos of the day is. I don't know. Could you for architecture?
There's a few trends. I mean, I call them trends because that's what I see them. I mean, I don't know if there's an ism that architects can all get behind.
Yep.
Not that there ever was one that everyone could get behind, but I don't think there's one that is the big one of today.
Yeah.
I don't think that exists, and I think
It's kind of fun though.
it's probably natural that it evolved to this point. If my kind of reading of it is correct, it's probably natural that we arrived at this point, because I think with everyone becoming much more informed about things and more free to vocalize their own individual thoughts, that naturally you're not going to get these giant movements. I think that's the case. And so for me, it's weird in architecture school, you don't really, like, I think people come to school thinking they're going to learn how to do classical architecture. Is that going to be one studio, like how to draw a classical building, then how to do a modern building, how to draw a postmodern building or whatever, because this is typically how the general public sees architecture in these very clear style classifications. But really architecture school ends up being the fundamentals of design. And then you're basically you're taught how to just come up with a really good question that someone else hasn't thought of perhaps, and then come up with a solution for that question in a design. And so you aren't taught like specific styles.
Yep.
Is it the same thing for landscape architecture school, or is it like, today we're learning about how to do whatever garden?
No, it's the same thing, largely. It's problem solving. Ultimately, at the end of the day, kind of what we both do is solve problems, though I think the media in which we solve those problems is different from architecture to landscape architecture. But yeah, I don't think there is a great prevailing ism. I like sometimes loosely describe Terremoto's work is post-internet, because that's like a lovely
Post-internet.
because it's like a lovely catch-all for I think describing that like everything is everywhere all the time, and I think people can cull from like just the amount of information that's floating around. I think kind of informs our work in that you've looked at our work a little bit, or in that I think you can probably see that we don't follow any one way of designing.
Right.
We're interested in Japanese gardens and French gardens and old Hollywood, in vacant lots, in just emergent vegetation, things like that. And so not following any sort of like clear formal code, we don't describe by anything like that, means that we create work that from project to project looks quite different.
Right.
Which is interesting, which is more interesting for us, which is how we practice.
Do
everybody is wired that way necessarily.
Yeah, do a lot of landscape architecture firms operate that way, or are they mostly, they have some styles they were to keep using, but some kind of, formal style or whatever set of rules that they kind of adhere to?
Yeah, I think most practices have clear styles in a way that we do not, which early days especially was very confusing when we would get hired for a client would hire us and say, well, what am I going to get? Because you're, am I going to get these straight lines, or am I going to get this meadow, or am I going to get this thing? And to which our answer was usually like, where we end up is usually a function of you as a client, the context, the site, and like conversations and dreaming about things. Yeah,
and that description, that kind of, I was going to say pitch, but that sounds a little bit schemy. That way of describing something to the client, to me, sounds very appealing and very exciting if I was to be a client. Of course, I'm a designer, so I guess I'd probably be the worst client. But I do.
Architects usually are. No, I'm just kidding.
Actually, someone was telling us that there's like 3 people, as an architect, there's 3 people you never want to work for. The one is never work for an attorney. The second one was fellow architects, and then the third doctors. Doctors. I don't know why doctors was on his list. But
I've worked for all 3.
All 3?
They're all awful. No, I'm kidding. Other designers can be hard.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes they'll know. I actually find the client that's the worst fit is a person who kind of knows what they want. If you know what you want, don't hire me. Yeah. So,
but I think that what you said makes a lot of sense, and to me, it sounds like it would be very exciting, because then as a client, you're getting something that is going to be particular to you, perhaps it's going to be special, and you also know that the person working on it presumably will put, you could guess, more effort than someone who's just going to kind of copy paste or just repeat what they've done before. But there are definitely some architects, landscape architects, designers who very strongly adhere to their interests, and as a result, their forms end up being kind of similar from project to project, and they claim, with complete confidence, and that is a good thing, because that means I'm advancing my knowledge of this particular, way of doing things.
And I think that's okay, and there's like room in the world for that. That's just not Terremoto.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, we're just wired differently.
So then after Berkeley, you stayed up there, and you worked at...
I worked at a couple firms. I worked at Peter Walker and Partners, and then I worked at Surface Design, and Surface Design was a wonderful place. Roderick, James, and Jeff were my bosses, and I was not in a tailspin coming out of school, but as you guys know, school doesn't really prepare you for the working world. I think academia is a very different thing than having a job. And I was so lucky enough to land at Surface Design, and it was a great office full of like friends and mentors, and I was a young guy, relatively inexperienced, and they gave me like a lot of responsibility, and it was amazing. And I was there for about 3 years, and then both the move to Los Angeles and kind of like the deeper understanding that I wanted to do it on my own terms, like wholly, kind of led me to very like tearfully like leave them, though we're still friends, and I'm so thankful for them. But yeah, so then when I knew I wanted to do it on my own, I did. And Alan worked at Surface Design as well. And it wasn't like really that well thought out. We weren't like calculating like, let's leave and start our own thing. It was a little bit more haphazard than that. I left. He's a little bit more conservative than I. He didn't want to leave quite yet. And so once I had like, it only took like 2 or 3 months. Once I had like 4 or 5 jobs lined up, he was like, okay,
wow.
Let's do this. And then what we did is it was important to us to not kind of feature the work of previous offices that we had worked at. Not because we didn't like the work, more that it's a common thing. You'll see a young firm but all the projects in their portfolio are their previous office. And that's okay. But we didn't want to do that. And so what we did is we dove headfirst into tiny residential projects that allowed us to make a lot of mistakes, learn like an insane amount of information, and kind of build our portfolio like pretty quickly. That of like work that was explicitly Terremoto's. So we did a lot of really unglamorous, tough projects that we lost money on for several years as we kind of built the thing from scratch. Yeah, but it was great. Also, it was super fun. I like pine nostalgic for those days now because it's a very different thing.
And that was all in the Bay Area?
No, I was here.
Okay.
And Alan was in the Bay, and we had little projects in both places, and we were both heavily involved in all of them.
It's kind of crazy that you guys decided to do this thing together, and you start from the beginning by being split in different cities. Did you guys ever think like maybe we should just do separate offices, or?
You know, I never wanted to do it alone. I don't like being alone. I'm a social creature, and I feel like to have a practice where you can't say like, is my client being, is it my client being insane, or to have a sounding board? And Alan's like a really wonderful guy, talented designer. He's Cal Poly slow, so he also has like this. He's a little bit more construction oriented. He can build beautiful construction document sets and build everything. I can do that, but with less elegance than Alan. I'm a little bit more of the philosophy. My mind is in the sky kind of thing. So we pair well. I'm terrible with money. He's super good with money. So there's like a balance. So it's been a great decision, and it's worked out well. Now that the bummer is like, I miss him. I know like he's like my friend, and business partner, and I don't see him that often. We started this thing to do it together, and it's just like through natural evolution, like I see him less and less. But hi, Alan. Anyways, miss you, buddy. So yeah, it's all good.
So you guys are focusing mostly on residential landscaping, right?
Not anymore. What's happened is now Alan has a team of 4 people: Casey, Sarah, Story, and Nadia, and I have a team of 8-ish. We have some maternity leave in the office right now. 8-ish, 9-ish people. Jenny, Diego. This is a good exercise. Jenny, Diego, Catherine, Rachel, Eric, Sam. Oh no, Lauren Hammer. I think that's everyone. And
that's pretty good. I would panic.
And we have an intern as well, Danny. So I have a team of 8-ish people, and so what's happened is that we don't do those tiny residential projects anymore, simply because financially I can't write. I used to write a fee proposal for $4,000 or whatever it was, and then lose money hand over fist on the project. So thankfully we don't do that anymore. So what we are is increasingly selective about the residential projects we take on, but I still love residential because you can explore an idea quickly, and it's conversational, and I love that. And it's great. So we're getting more selective in terms of keeping our price point higher as we kind of get a little bit of a reputation. And but I'll still break those rules, and especially if something's architecturally interesting. If I get the opportunity to work on it, like a Schindler, like all those rules, I just throw them out the door, and I'm like, yeah, absolutely, I'll lose money on this. And then now we're kind of going into like a nice pocket of hospitality and commercial, but the office is it's a blessing, but I'm doing everything I can. I don't want to really have an office over like 10 to 12 people. And so corporate America has kind of found us recently, which is fine. And so, but bigger projects are landing on our doorstep. And though that's wonderful, I oftentimes have to turn them down simply because in order to service a project of a certain size, you need to have an office of a certain size. Yeah. But I've worked in big offices. I don't like big offices. So now it's kind of like this fight to be like, okay, how do we stay small and weird? So it's good. These are good problems, but still, I have to kind of defend what Terremoto is so that it doesn't turn into a thing that I don't want it to be, if that makes sense.
And so the 12 number, is that both offices combined, or you want to limit
that would be
location?
My office.
Okay,
yeah.
Right.
The team that I kind of run, who are amazing designers, but I don't have an interest in managing a bigger operation than that. Basically. Sure.
Are you guys able to? I definitely want to talk about the issue you just brought up, but are you guys able to teamwork really greatly with the office up in San Francisco, or is it mostly you just help each other critiqued and design-wise as opposed to actual production?
There's been moments where we'll jump on a project for them and vice versa and help out, but just logically where the project is, it makes sense it makes more sense for the people who are closer to the project to work on it. So we do piggyback, and we do office retreats where we go to Big Bear and go on a boat together, or what did we do last year? Or we go bowling, or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. We're hopefully going to Sea Ranch in the near future as a team. So there's not a lot of overlap in terms of production, but we can be pretty casual about it because the work that they're producing is amazing, and I'd like to think the work we're producing is very good as well. And so because we're just in this psychic alignment, it's more fun to it feels like we have brothers and sisters up in the Bay Area.
Gotcha.
Kind of a thing.
Gotcha.
So
that's really cool. I like that way of thinking about it.
Yeah. And they get to do wineries, which I'm jealous about, you know what I mean? And then we get to do work for weird Hollywood people, and they're jealous about that. So there's advantages to each place. So
I mean, I wonder, I guess 12 people is a certain kind of size of group where it could be manageable. I wonder how high you could go before it starts to go past that line to where your job becomes quite different, becomes managing, or the quality of the designs, I'm sure is another concern, goes down. And maybe
the office
18?
Culture too.
The office culture.
I feel the 12 people size, it's a big family. Right?
Everybody knows each other at 12. I feel and bigger than that, you start to not you work with people whom you don't necessarily know very well.
Right, right.
I think it was, I don't know who it was. I think it was Greg Lynn who I heard give a lecture once, and he said something along the lines of the size of a baseball team, 10 to 12 is how he likes to run his office, and I was that's cool. I don't know, that's a team where you still have personal relationships. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I could see that. I mean, I think you could maybe bump it to 18, but beyond that, it gets kind of crazy. 18's a number I'm familiar with because that's the size of the studios that I was in.
Oh, interesting.
And that was pretty good. There's always maybe a few people in the studio you don't know as well, but it's still close enough. But certainly once you get up to 25, it becomes a different beast. Et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And then also there's a threshold. I never want to have an assistant. Not to sound self-important, but I don't want to. So far we don't have an accounting person, and as you ratchet up, you need to have those sorts of that infrastructure. Yeah. And not that I'm scared of that infrastructure, but I'd like to put it off as long as I can.
Why?
So, I don't know. Because I've been doing it this way so far, and I've gotten away with it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe for those positions, it seems like bringing those people on would be have less potential to negatively impact the work itself because they're kind of different, different roles.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. It might allow me to focus more. To be honest, at this point in my role is I'm a communicator. I do zero landscape architecture, which I kind of miss a little bit.
Sure.
So you bring up a good point. Thanks, Dad.
I'm just thinking out loud.
No, totally. The invoices always go out late because I'm the one that does them.
Yeah.
So these are things, and it'll evolve and change and shift as we move along.
But that's a fantastic position to be in, as you said, to have these problems. It's a great spot to be in. The larger clients for the hospitality and commercial was the other one you said. Do you find, so one of the differences that you mentioned is that for some of those projects you need bigger staff, which is kind of the issue, one of the issues. Do you find though that those clients with those projects, you're less able to be conceptual or fun or these kinds of things because they might tend to be more mainstream or corporate, or the opposite.
Yes and no. I think it all depends on the client and the project. Like Platform Park, which is a park that we recently completed under like the MTA line adjacent to Platform, the mall in Culver City. Like in theory, that's kind of like a corporate or a commercial client, but I think they found our work and they liked that it was weird and experimental, and they wanted something weird and experimental, and they didn't have a lot of money, and that's a recipe for an awesome project. But to be honest, it's like a small budget, like a limited budget, a client who's willing to let you be experimental, and also the project had a super fast timeline. So in a way, I think our business model thrives well with those sorts of challenges. So yeah, if a client has like kind of more conservative, conventional needs, they just don't. We're not the office for them. So does that answer your question?
No, totally. It makes total sense, and it's something that we've kind of become more and more aware of, is this idea that if you have an office, you do what you do, to a certain degree, and if a client doesn't come to you for that, then they just go to someone else.
Yep.
And that's just what it is.
Yeah. The world is large.
And it's, I mean, that's easy to say when work's coming in. If there's no work coming in, then it becomes a problem.
Yeah, but I would probably be less picky if I was running around looking for work.
Right.
Yeah.
Actually, it just occurred to me that you had mentioned that you were listening to one of the recent episodes we did about the park in San Francisco, the Salesforce. Have you been up there?
I have not.
Oh, you should. We'll have you back on and ask you what do you think about it.
That's actually the work of one of my former offices.
Oh, is it?
PWP did it.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay, that's why the name sounded familiar. Right,
yeah,
right.
I have not seen it in person. I've heard things. I'll leave it at that. What were your thoughts on it?
Well, disclaimer: we're not landscape architects, and obviously when we do like a recording about a thing, it's kind of. This might sound like a cop-out, and it's not meant to be, but it's always from the position of someone who has maybe a better eye for design and the built environment, but isn't a capital A, capital C architectural critic or landscape architecture critic, and isn't taking it so seriously. So, like a discussion about any park or building is half about other things that are not related to it necessarily.
That's what I like about your podcast, though. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So no, I thought so the first thing that happens for me, and probably for the both of us, is you compare it to the High Line, because from New York for X amount of years, which is a totally unfair comparison because they're very different in the majority of the ways, and they're only similar in like one way. The thing there's a couple things I didn't care for with it. The first was that at the perimeter of, it's an elevated park, right?
I've seen images and extensive.
Is that at the perimeter they have a bunch of greenery, which is really fantastic and interesting because there's a bunch of different, 150, 200,000 different kinds of species of plants or whatever. So that's cool. But they're so tall and full that you actually blocks the view of the city more than it should. Yep. And so for me, because that kind of elevated park right next to and attached to towers is a pretty rare situation, it would have been better if there had been a little more play or porosity to kind of get exposure to the outside.
Interesting.
And there's some kind of weird art installation moments that have. There's this one that's like a fountain that's runs a pretty long length of the park.
I know the fountain you're describing. Yeah.
And there's a tall. The installation itself is cool or whatever, but there's a tall frosted piece of glass behind the fountain, and so between there's the person, the fountain, the glass, and then greenery, and then the city. But the glass is so tall that you're just basically, you could be anywhere. You could be at the ground level or inside of a building or
so wherever. It's a very internal park.
Very internal park. And that glass frosted wall goes such a long way that you kind of you feel like you're totally detached from everything else.
Okay.
So
I want to see it.
I don't mind actually the fact that you feel like you're almost in like an oasis.
An oasis, yeah.
And I don't mind that the plants were tall, that you couldn't see, to your eye level, the building that was next to you. What I wish was that you could get to the edge to see what was below. That would have been interesting.
Yeah.
I thought the planting was amazing. I didn't care for the loopy layout.
Okay.
Because if it felt to me like a museum, like you go, you look on one side, then you go around, you look on the other side.
Yeah.
That was my biggest criticism.
I think in general, not specifically to that park, there's a thing in landscape architecture that's kind of impressed upon you in school, which I would say Terremoto is kind of like actively coming out against, is like program or prescriptive landscape spaces where you walk into a park and it's like, here's how you go, and this is where you stop, and here's an amphitheater, and there's all these like little things. I'm much more interested right now, like our platform park was kind of an exercise in like no program. Like there's grass and there's like these things, but whatever was so wrong with going outside to just be in the garden.
Yeah.
And kind of getting back to that. That's actually more interesting to me than like an amphitheater, or I don't know. A lot of like, I feel like civic scale parks suffer the same, end up having kind of a kit of parts of the same sorts of elements, which I just think, I don't know, that's not.
But then it feels almost like, okay, I have a checklist of things I have to check boxes off, and I'm not really like feeling how to put them all together and make it a coherent whole, right?
Yeah.
So, it's interesting.
Have you been to the Getty and seen the garden at the Getty Center?
The villa or the
No, not the
Richard Meier's thing.
Yeah.
We did actually an installation there. Yeah, it was like an edible boxes installation we did with an artist and friend, Julia Sherman.
Edible boxes? Mm-hmm. Does that mean boxes you can eat or edibles in boxes?
Sorry, edibles, edible food grown in raised beds.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Boxes of pot.
Oh no, are you going to ask me how I feel about that garden?
Oh, yeah.
Oh man, I have a very complex relationship with that garden. Do you want to know? Or?
Yeah, definitely. Because we were there not long ago.
It's so I guess like the subtext is that like Bob Irwin is like one of my favorite artists. The book he wrote a book was written on him. I think that is called. I'm going to botch it. Seeing is forgetting the name of the thing one sees, or something like that. Kind of this abstract sentence. But that book was one of my points of inspiration to start a business, because he's like this funny like guy in LA who like he's kind of like a ladies' man and he fixes cars, and then like something clicks inside him like internally, and then he goes on like this trajectory of like almost like this monastic. He basically recedes from like civilization and does nothing but focus on his art, and it's like this. It's just this incredible book, like his like transformation like as a human being into an artist and all these things, and I love his art. It's some of my. It's like incomprehensibly good, and I don't like that garden.
We talked to make sure we're talking about the one where you kind of wind down and there's a circuit. Okay, right.
I understand historically like the conditions that happened, and my understanding of it is that Richard Meier was basically planning on designing the garden. The Getty didn't want the experience of the Getty to be monolithically a Richard Meier experience. Richard Meier, who's now Me Too'd and gone, which is great.
Me Too.
Which is good. He was up to bad things, but he was an intellectual powerhouse. He was a big personality. Yeah. So in my understanding, they picked Bob Irwin because he was ready to. He was the kind of guy who would be willing to lock horns. And actually, if you look at the thing in plan, it looks to me like Bob Irwin got like a prison shank, and like kind of like in the plan, like it's like this kind of very beautiful but like act of like sacrilegiousness, like onto this like very composed grid. All that being said, like when you go to that park, it's like you can almost, as a landscape architect, I'm going to be critical, but you can almost like see a person figuring out landscape architecture like in the project. Like the ADA ramp is actually like quite clumsy to me. I'm all about breaking rules as it relates to horticulture, but he just broke them in like the wrong way. And so I actually think the planting design of it is in not good taste.
When you say he broke the rules but in the wrong way, what do you mean?
So planting. So in the world of botany, oftentimes I would say that plants like occupy certain worlds.
Okay.
And you can easily like lump plants into kind of like an old Hollywood tableau, or native plants look like this, or plants for Japanese gardens kind of look like this. So you're able to do that. In our work, I enjoy kind of like sampling and like kind of breaking those rules and making a garden that's a cactus garden, but that's also kind of explicitly trying to be Japanese or whatever these things. Like I'm interested in kind of like challenging convention as it relates to botany. But at the Getty, I think it was done maybe perhaps like on just aesthetics or something, but like you'll get like a Muhlenberger regens, which is like a native meadowgrass to California, next to like a spherical boxwood. And
I don't know what that is, but I assume it's very different.
Yeah, it's a plant that's
I can tell by
more
your face.
French.
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
And there's like if you made like a bigger project about that kind of juxtaposition, maybe there's something interesting
Right.
there. But when you just do that like 100 times randomly, it kind of like loses focus and clarity, and it feels like I like get dizzy when I go there.
Yeah.
So, anyways, I love Bob Irwin as an artist, but that garden is very troublesome for me. But it's like the most successful, it's an incredibly successful public space, and this goes into a whole other interesting thing is that you can still have bad design and it can be a successful space.
Right? That's
yeah.
an interesting thing.
Yeah.
So
That's an
people love it.
interesting thing.
Yeah, people take pictures of it forever, and they always
Right.
will. But it just drives me crazy because I'm a snob. Yeah,
It might be good now, but it could have been better is the thing.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. We had been to the Getty, it was like a year ago now. It was
Okay.
a while ago. But visited, walked around as much as we could. It's a big place. And then visited the garden. And I wasn't too thrilled with it. I was aware of kind of the history through, I think it was a PBS documentary that I saw. I don't know if you've seen it, but it tracks the process, the design and kind of building process of the Getty, a documentary about Richard Meier. And he has a huge, you had the locking of the horns that exactly happened in the documentary between him and the landscape architect, the designer of the garden. And Meier in the film throws basically a tantrum. He comes off as a child. He goes into a room, starts swearing, he's ruining the project. But so we visited the place, saw the garden, and the thing I didn't care for is that it seemed I tend to like spaces that are not quite so prescriptive. I mean, I think, and maybe that's also why I don't. The one in the Salesforce Park is also have kind of an aversion to it, but certainly the Getty Garden is even much more prescriptive because there's basically one path you go down, and like halfway down, like you get tired. Well, maybe you don't get tired, but it's kind of like exhausting. And he crams in so many different things, and even for a person who just knows absolutely nothing about plants, it's kind of like before you even get to the bottom, you feel like you've spent a day at IKEA. You're just overwhelmed with information. And it doesn't seem to have any rhyme or reason, at least that I could tell. And so, yeah, it felt it felt like I was kind of a victim to the garden in a way,
I like that's an interesting sentence. Yeah.
I also have terrible allergies.
Oh, do you? Okay. Yeah. Well, there's also things that are really good, and I don't think I don't know who's responsible for them, but just like that grassy knoll.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. It's just like a simple slope. Somebody planted Eucalyptus citriodora, which are it's a problematic tree for many reasons, but it's that eucalyptus that has almost like skin-like bark. It's like flesh-colored, and there's like a kind of a grove of them, and like that in front of the building is like absolutely exquisite. But it's a troublesome space. But people love it. So.
So how much knowledge do you have to have? Like, do you know like all the plants' names, or do you only know the one in California because that's where you learn landscape architecture? Like, how does it work?
When you're in school, there's an amazing class that's like a horticultural identification class where you and a bunch of like students walk around with like these clipboards, and you walk, and the teacher goes stop, and then it was Judith Stilgenbauer, was my professor, and she said, okay, this is the plant we're here to look at. And then we would kind of talk about it, Latin name, common name, its characteristics, its watering needs, sun, like soil conditions, sun conditions. And so that was a totally revelatory class, because then suddenly I remember like, oh my God, I see plants everywhere and I can identify them and I know where they're from. But I would say definitely my understanding of horticulture is super regional. Like I would say my understanding of horticulture in Southern California is very strong and Northern California is pretty strong. But that if we did a project recently in New Mexico, and I kind of have to completely relearn. But what was interesting in the New Mexico project is that it was in Santa Fe, and Santa Fe is a very specific place, like climatically in terms of the altitude. So like the range of plants that survive there is simply much smaller, which is almost like refreshing in a way. It's like, whereas in California we're almost cursed and blessed with like what we can grow because everything grows here. But yeah, I walk around and look at plants and I'm always thinking, because it's this constant inevitable flow of information, which is really amazing. And I'm interested in native plants, and I'm interested in the weird hedges you have outside. Yeah, so planting is fascinating. Once you like take that class, like you can't ever see the world quite the same way, which is interesting.
A blessing and a curse.
yeah. And then it gets into other things, if you believe that plants have meaning and like the ecological aspects of them, like it's like endlessly complex and kind of fun. And our work touches on that, I think.
If plants have meaning, I mean, beyond ecological ones is.
Yeah. I have a theory. It's going to take me 3 or 4 minutes to describe it.
Is that
okay?
We got plenty of time.
I have a theory that I'm working on, that I've been working on, that may manifest in a book in the near future. I recently spoke with some people about it. It's a book no one will buy, except plant geeks. The working theory is horticultural semiotics, plants and meaning. And the idea is that it is a lens through which you can kind of view the botanical panorama of Southern California. I haven't figured it out necessarily in Northern California, but where you can look out at like the panorama of botany in Southern California, and through horticultural identification and kind of a basic understanding of the botanical histories of Los Angeles, kind of then arrive at meaningful conclusions as to why Los Angeles looks the way it does. Do you mind opening that window? Does that ruin things? It'll ruin the light. And I was going to say
Good
that only
point.
because I could point at plants. But
Yeah.
anyways, so to break it down, basically all plants that you see kind of it doesn't really apply to the individual garden. This more applies to as you're kind of driving along the freeway, you'll see eucalyptus and you'll see a palm tree, and you'll see ivy growing up to the side of an underpass, and you'll see Italian cypresses like in the distance. The idea is that with this theory, you can kind of explain why everything is where it is and why. And you can break down like all species into kind of 4 broad categories. Those categories being native species, basically the plants that existed in Southern California prior to human development. LA as oasis, which is kind of Los Angeles when it was developed in the like go west young man, early booming Hollywood. That's where you get the palm tree. There is a Washingtonia filifera that is native to kind of the Palm Springs area, but beyond that, palm trees aren't native to this area.
Right.
And so it's like this kind of jarring contradiction that like essentially the psychic icon of our city is actually like a non-native species.
Yeah.
And then you also get like kind of, so then if you go through the categories, and then you can kind of, I've basically made lists of the species that kind of go into these categories. So then after Los Angeles as oasis, there's post-war. Basically, post-World War II, a lot of things were happening in our country, single-family home ownership, and that's kind of where you get the grass lawn. That's where you get foundation plantings, that kind of shrubbery along the edges. I would say this campus is basically landscaped in a post-war sort of idiom.
Yeah.
And then lastly, invasive species, which is where it gets incredibly complicated in that there's species that are in these previous categories that then essentially escape and then run amok and run wild, which is why
The eucalyptus, right?
Eucalyptus globulus, Eucalyptus citriodora, Eucalyptus sideroxylon, they're everywhere, and they're not from here because they're invasive species. The beautiful ivy that when you kind of go on the 101 downtown, that you see it growing up underneath like the monolithic concrete structures, that's Hedera helix. It's from Algeria, I want to say, and it was brought here for whatever reason, and now it kind of has escaped and it does its thing. So then with those kind of categories, what I'm kind of postulating is that you can kind of drive around and make sense of why Southern California looks the way it does. You can point at a plant and say, that's here because it corresponds to a time in the 1940s when there was this notion of LA being this mix of like world Spanish, Middle Eastern, these sorts of things. And so I'm working with a photographer. It's mostly a photography book, to be honest, where we're kind of taking like these botanically focused pictures of the city and then kind of diagramming it out and taking it apart and saying like, well, this plant is here because of this and it corresponds to this like historical moment, and this plant is here because now it's an invasive species.
Gotcha.
And I think so that's like a thing that I've been
very
noodling
cool.
on.
You should turn it into an app so everyone can use their iPhones and just
interesting. Maybe I'll make money that way because no one's going to buy this book. So yeah. Anyways,
that sounds really cool. Do you think that it's a problem to bring in a species of plant that's not native? Because so again, my knowledge of landscape architecture is very minimal, but it does seem to be kind of a trend or a movement or something where when there's a description of a landscape architecture project, if there's use of native species, that's like heralded. That's like the first thing they say as a way to maybe promote, market, or to make the project look good. That's my reading of like how I see things. Is that?
Yeah. And it's hard. It's a tough topic to talk about because it's a very loaded topic, native species. So yes, we've done like irreversible damage to the ecological happenings of the LA metropolitan area. And native species are species that evolved to live here without supplemental irrigation, and they provide habitat to pollinators and to animals. And so these are species that were always meant to be here. And we've screwed that up, essentially our presence. But it gets complicated because I would also argue that the manipulation of horticulture is inseparable from human civilization, in that basically we created our societies so that we could farm. And in doing that, we've also always essentially gardens from the dawn of human civilization as well. So my kind of like philosophical approach to native species is that we use them in basically every project that we do. Some projects they'll represent 100% of the species we use. Some projects it'll be 50%. Some projects it'll be 30%. But I think it's deeply important, and it's something that's fundamentally like important to like Terremoto as an office to kind of promote local ecology. That said, it's also a very polemical world because the native plant community has a tendency to tell everybody else what they're doing is wrong.
Sure.
And I don't believe that is a way of winning over the hearts and minds of the greater populace. So I would rather build native-focused and native-heavy projects while not necessarily always being explicitly native species, but incorporating natives into every project we do as a way of kind of like winning people over it. Because also, like my mother, for example, has like a lot of negative connotations with native species because at this time of year, for example, a native garden looks pretty beat up. Or one could argue. I actually find that beauty, like when things are kind of scraggy and it's like early fall, I find that very beautiful. But a lot of people who don't understand, a lot of people have different notions of beauty that are still tied up in like these post-war kind of things.
Sure, the picturesque.
Perfect. Exactly.
Perfect
Things should be green
green.
all the time and that. So I think what a lot of our work is trying to do is kind of like softly push things in the direction of more native ecology. And I think as it continues to grow and people come to understand it, and to be honest, what needs to happen is notions of beauty need to change. And I think that's going to happen. We're living in fraught times, and even though it's a really terrible time to live in many ways, I think it's a time of great change and upheaval. And I think that planting horticulture will be increasingly more native focused, because I think that's a way of like getting back to a healthier ecology.
So when you say that the perception of beauty needs to change, and you think it is starting to change or will change soon or something like this, is that because of for economical reasons, or because of is what's going to drive that change? Is it economics, or is it because we just kind of need to for the climate's sake, or is there's a social reason that people are yearning for, or something like that?
What will drive that change?
And to clarify,
that
when you
your awareness of beauty could be broader than what the standard that you've been gaining, right?
Right. That's what you mean by perception changing, right? Or evolving to be more inclusive, I guess is fair to say?
I would say, like, it's hard to be objective about this because we live in, like, a dense metropolitan cultural center. But I would say that in Los Angeles, I feel like there's, like, kind of a rhizomatic, like, greater awareness among the creative communities that our attitudes need to change on horticulture, ecology, waste. I think like there's a lot of like no waste things going on right now. That's interesting. Energy consumption, all these things. And I think, like the interest in native species and kind of a return to simplicity, I think is a lot of what these things are like seeking, I think is afoot and is happening.
Interesting.
So I don't know what will drive it necessarily. That's an interesting question. I think people wanting to be at peace with themselves, and it's a hard thing to do, like in the era of climate change.
Yeah.
So
I think that makes sense, and I think the up and coming generations are going to be much more informed and therefore aware, and have these kind of. I think these conflicts are becoming much more internalized by the future people. I think that's also really interesting. You know, you said that going strictly 100% native species only is kind of maybe flawed for a couple of reasons. One is that it's not a good way to kind of deal with the greater population, which I think is smart and it makes sense to me. And I also like the fact that you kind of went all the way back to, well, but as humans, it's not like totally what we do anyway. Like our existence on the planet is to, maybe it's not to fuck it up, but it's to change it a little bit to fit our comfort or moral ideas or principles or whatever
feed
it
our
is.
families.
Yeah, feed our families, and so that has to be part of it too. It makes sense to me.
Yeah, it's very cool. It's very complex. Talking about native species is like always this like thing, but it's important, and so
it's interesting.
It's politics basically.
Yeah, right. I had taken a couple courses at the graduate level, and they were, one of them I think was a landscape urbanism course, but it wasn't the kind of landscape urbanism you were talking about. That was just the name of the course, I think. Or maybe it was urbanism, I forget. But anyway, it struck me as being totally different from like an architecture course or architecture theory course, where again you talk about buildings basically, buildings and art, but it's still about like material man-made things. And in this other course though, it's like it was like the scope at which you have to look at the world became so much wider, because you're dealing with the idea of landscape, which is a very broad term I came to understand. It doesn't mean just gardens, but it means like full areas of the world and landscape, and then how it relates to politics and also climate change, and therefore like the entire Earth and the changes the Earth is going through. And the shocking thing after going through that class was like, this is a super complex issue, and it's kind of almost more important than a lot of this other kind of building stuff, which is it's unfair comparison, I suppose. But at the time, it was like, well, who cares about how the building looks? Like we have these other pressing issues which are more directly expressed or worked through in landscape design.
And that was actually in school. Generally, I feel like our studio projects were attempts at saving the world through landscape architecture.
Really?
That's kind of what we focused on. It's landscape architecture also simultaneously serving infrastructural roles, which I actually do believe is really important. And it's not something that we do at the scale of the projects we do now, though we incorporate like all sorts of sustainable practices into what we do. But the LA River being like the kind of icon, or like the beacon, as it were, like for that kind of a thing, where there's a resource that's been essentially destroyed and stripped of its ecological functioning and its ability to be a place, because we've, put the thing in a cavern of concrete. But that if we were to redo it, that it could also serve roles, ecological, cultural, social, kind of all these things.
It always struck me, and actually I think I was told this when I was a student, by a landscape architect professor at Cal Poly, who at the time I thought was an arrogant shithead.
There are those.
Yeah, he might have been. No, he's a really nice guy. But he was telling me that, like, he would come as a critic to the architecture reviews, and of course, the architecture students, being their close group of people, were like, who's this guy? He doesn't belong on this side of the campus. And he would say things like, you architects, all you care about is like the building and form, but there's these other issues. And he felt very strongly that the average, it's a gross generalization, but the average landscape architect was just had a much bigger picture in mind, and was much more aware and sensitive to the reality of the situation, which is the social, the cultural, and the ecological, and all these things, than the architect is. And for whatever reason, that always stuck with me. It's not always true, obviously, but whenever I see an architect that's taking on a master planning scale project or a landscape project, that's the first thing I think about. Is like, okay, does it seem like this is an architect trying to do architecture to address the issues we're talking about? And if that's the case, I always wonder, would a landscape architect think about this problem slightly differently, or try to solve it differently?
We probably would. It's a thing that happens where I'll be asked to, or Terremoto will be asked to work on a project, and I'll go and meet the client. I did this not too long ago, and I kind of show up at the site, and the architect has already done like a master plan layout. I recently turned down a project because essentially the critical thinking that I would want to do had already been done by the architect. So that made the project inevitably less attractive to me. And I didn't want to inherit this thing and then be forced to figure it out when I might have not necessarily arrived at the right conclusions. So it happens. It's a funny thing, and I don't know if it doesn't come from a place of like avarice or anything like that strong, but it's a very common thing where I'll come to a project and the building is already sited, for example, and to me, I'm kind of like, I want to be a part of that conversation because I want to have an opinion on where the building sits in the land and why. Yeah. And sometimes I'll walk away from a project because of that, and sometimes I'll figure it out and we'll work it out. But architects tend to be okay doing a bit of landscape architecture. I find that in a way that if somebody said, will you like remodel my bathroom? I'd be like, absolutely not. I'm not an architect, so hire an architect. Anyways, I don't mean to disparage architects. I'm married to one. But I love them.
Are you really?
Yeah, it happens.
That's funny that you're married to one. Does she practice? Has she worked at an office?
She does. She's worked at offices. She's starting her own small practice now.
Oh, great.
We just had our second child, so we're in the clumsy transition of getting her back to work and prioritizing her career, which is just a little bit hard to do when you have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. So it's a lot. She's gonna start her own thing in the very near future.
Would you guys ever team up?
No.
Terremoto plus architecture.
I have worked with her, and it's gone well. She actually has a desk in our office as well, and we don't. It's complicated. At home, she's the boss. At Terremoto, I'm the boss.
Okay.
So
So at 6 p.m. or whatever the day ends.
Yeah, so it doesn't necessarily always work that well together because then we're working together and then she's very assertive and I'm like, that's fine, but anyways, so it's complicated. We do work together we have this group project called Children that we're focusing on.
Is this a project or like the name of a
No, our children.
I'm sorry. You know what it is? Because we have a friend of ours who had an office called Family, and then he started a new office called Food. So now anytime I hear a generic like Children, that must be the name of an office. It sounds very
Children's a good name for an office.
Not a bad name, actually.
Yeah, not bad.
But going
That's
back
funny.
to how you get on projects and work on projects, so you can come on a project as early as locating the building on the site?
Yeah, I like to come before anything's done. And too often, I'm asked to come on too late.
Yeah.
Well, I think...
So like even before demolition, clearing up the site, you might want to see like what's there before
Yeah, absolutely.
anything works, right?
Existing conditions are massively important to our work at Terremoto, and oftentimes there are divining rod. An existing tree or the topography or like natural drainage patterns will inform where we want to put a thing or why.
Yeah.
In a way that I think landscape architects are kind of more sensitive to that than architects in that. And it's fine, I think, but architects tend to think with more of like a tabula rasa, just clean slate approach.
Yeah.
So we like to get in as early as possible.
I mean, it makes total sense. When you were talking about working with the architect, which is a relationship that I'm curious to hear more about, one of the reasons why I think some of this happens is that architects think they can do everything. That's like, and I don't think that's. I think that's pretty much true.
That's accurate.
I mean, I think we know we can't do everything, but a lot of them kind of pretend they can. I mean, it's even in education or in practice, like, oh, we can do graphic design, we can do presentations, we can do that, we can write. It's like, well, we can do like a quarter of all of that, like for each one a little bit, but not fully. So I think that's partly why we're always overstepping, perhaps. But it makes total sense that the landscape architect would come on at the very, very beginning, just as much as the architects, because I think also maybe there's this perception from some architects that it's like, we do the building, we figure it all out, we have this outdoor space that exists as a square or a circle or whatever shape. Here, landscape architect, take over. Or I've already designed it, and just tell me what plans I need. Does this happen? Does you come across this fairly often?
Yep, it happens. And I tend to run in the opposite direction. It sounds mean, but the practices the architects and other like design practices that I tend to admire most tend to not be cross-disciplinary. I like people who do specific things. So sometimes, and I would just say like usually the work of like a firm that does architecture and landscape architecture and graphic design and all these things, it's like less my cup of tea. I like when people like focus on a thing. Yeah.
And so then when you work on a project with an architecture office, let's say, who is more focused, it becomes more like a temporary collaboration, project-based.
Totally. And I love working with architects, especially architects who let us do our thing. And now that we have a little bit more of a reputation, we're kind of sought after to do our thing, which is great. But then again, every project is so unique and totally different. I did Takashi Yanai's home. And that project was incredibly collaborative in that he kind of knew what he wanted. It's a little bit of an aberration of a project. This was more of like a friendship project. But he kind of knew what he wanted, and I kind of drew the plan, and then he kind of drew back on the plan, and then we shopped for the cactus together, and it was very like kind of design build and just like conversational. It was as much of an excuse for him and I to hang out, to be honest, as anything. And so, yeah, that was like an incredibly collaborative project. He designed the gate, and I sourced all the Acacia Teophylla and kind of things like that. But that's kind of an unconventional project. What's a more conventional project approach? We'll usually we'll get a site plan from an architect. They'll have an idea of how the building is formed, and then we'll kind of like draw it together. And usually I'm pretty soft-handed as like a designer. I've worked in offices where the principal's word is God, and what they draw is correct, and I'm not that. I'm actually more interested in doubt and like kind of not knowing. I think that's like a much more productive tool as like a designer, and starting with a lot of questions. So, and that's how we tend to design. I'll come to the first meeting with like 3 very different versions of a plan, and then we talk with the architect and the client and kind of see what fits and why. And usually the design ends up being like a hybrid of the thing.
Right.
So yeah.
How did this way of working evolve for you? Because it's, as you're talking, it makes sense to me. I understand. I've worked at offices that have been, you said they think they're God. I've also worked for offices where it's kind of how you described how you work. But this kind of more human, I don't know how to describe it, human approach to working with others in the design process, where do you think that comes from for you? As opposed to at the extreme end being the one who just sketches, you know.
I don't want to say like I'm a kind person because that sounds arrogant, but kind of kindness. I was raised to be kind, and I feel like I run an office where I try to be extremely respectful and kind to the people who work for me because I actually need them, and they need me. And so it's much more pleasant to work in an office environment like where everybody has each other's backs, right, and everyone is respectful and kind to each other. And so it's kind of the practice like I run. I'm in the lucky position where very talented landscape architects want to work at my office, which is a lovely position to be in. But now it's also great because now I hire these incredibly talented people and I give them a lot of autonomy. And that makes my job easier because they're incredible designers. And so I'm always like reviewing their work and, we still draw together and mark it up. But that giving people autonomy, I feel like is the best way to like really have a practice where people will stay a long time, right, because nothing's more frustrating than like being told what to do. So I give people autonomy, and we also we've done something structurally with our office. Alan and I took kind of an opinion on this early days where we weren't the salary model is essentially harmful, and oftentimes people are simply taken advantage of, and so we pay our employees hourly, like competitive rates. And if people have to work overtime, they do. Really? And then I don't feel bad because they're making time and a half. And consequently, it makes Alan and I kind of more thoughtful as time managers. And we don't run an office where people work 80 hours a week. It's like a 40 to 50 hour work week. And that's how we do it. And I think all those things come from wanting to respect the people at my office, and in turn, they respect me because I can give them that. So fostering a good office, you know what I mean? There's an art to that as well. And we've had no turnover for 5 years. So that's, I think, speaks to hopefully that ability. But we'll see. One day somebody will leave, and that's okay. Won't be the end of the world. But I think being kind and giving people autonomy is a way of living.
Yeah, I mean that's a great philosophy, and it's the strange thing is when we meet someone and we speak to someone like you who is doing things, I think the right way, in a good way, and when you talk about why it exists or how you do it, it seems very clear, right? I'm kind to them because I want them to be kind to me. I need them, so I'm going to be good to them, and et cetera. And it seems so crystal clear that it makes it confusing that why aren't other places doing it this way too, is what I end up thinking. But I think the hourly model is also really, really fascinating. And it's been done before, but that cannot be common. I don't even know if I know any other architecture or landscape. I don't know any landscape architecture firms, but any architecture firms that do that.
I make less money, basically, but I'm okay with that. It's more important to me to have an office of awesome people who are satisfied than me bringing home an extra $20,000 at the end of the year. Right. I'd rather. Yeah, there's longevity to what I'm doing. I think I don't mean to say it's super smart, but there's longevity to structuring an office this way because really the best thing that could happen is we get to get old together and super good at our jobs together, and we like grow together. And I mean, that would be the dream.
You know, the one flaw is that you're not going to grow their office. So all these people listening are like, kind of joined camp. Sorry, you didn't start. You missed it.
One day somebody will leave, and then we'll have an opening. Yeah. I mean, you guys know architecture and landscape architecture can be a really bad scene. Like professionally, like it can be like, you know, hostile, brutal work weeks, all these things. It doesn't have to be that way. You just, and that's why we've made our office not that way, because, it's kind of a DIY approach.
Yeah, and I don't know why. I mean, there's many reasons for why that's the case in architecture, and greed is one of them, I suppose. But I think it's also, there's just this belief that you need to have extreme dedication. And actually, only by being dedicated on the crazy extreme level are you dedicated at all. And I think for a lot of people who operate at those 80-hour work weeks or whatever it is, anything less than that is like, then you're just not dedicated to like our profession and our passion. You know,
Yeah,
kind of.
I call bullshit. It's actually, I think it makes the thing worse. So hopefully there's an improvement. I don't know. All I can do is run my office the way like I want to. So,
if I was in landscape architecture, I'd probably be handing you an application after.
I mean,
no one's rich yet, we're still all poor but happy and together. So,
are most of your employees landscape architects by education and training, or is there a mix of different people?
And I realized earlier when I was naming the people in the office, I forgot to say Don Wang.
You're also, I think, the first person that we've talked to who, I mean, I guess a lot of the people we interview have big offices, but even of the small offices, who bothers to go through and list people.
Oh, yeah. It's so important. It's like, it's almost absurd that it's just me here in a way, because we're such a team. Really, like, I'm kind of the mouthpiece because I write, essentially.
Because you write, is that what you said?
Yeah, because I tend to, like, write. So
okay.
like, Terremoto, the language as it relates to Terremoto mostly comes through me, but it's such a team effort. Like it's fun. Sorry, what was the question?
I don't remember. Are your employees, are they mostly landscape architects or?
Yes, they're basically all landscape architects with different degrees and backgrounds. I'm trying to think of people in the office. Eric has more of like an environmental policy background. I'm art history. Alan was Cal Poly SLO, so he did the 5 years, so he's kind of more technically oriented. I want to say Lauren Hammer did history of art and architecture as well. We have a few people who have, Diego Lopez and Don both have undergraduate degrees from Cal Poly Pomona. People bring Casey Toomey at our SF office has a background in fine art and industrial design. So we're all landscape architects. Back in the day, Alan and we had this thing where we were like, let's not hire landscape architects. Let's hire graphic designers and architects and have this thing. And it just doesn't make sense because we do need people who know plants. And we do need people who can think about these things in a certain way. And those toolkits tend to come from people who have degrees. I don't necessarily I'm not like a huge academia guy, but it makes sense to hire somebody who's been trained in a thing. Sure.
Yeah. Do you find that landscape architects tend to have a certain social wavelength that they all have in common, or that they see things culturally from a certain similar perspective?
Yeah. I don't think there's like groupthink going on by any means, but generally the office banter is fun because we all are interested in materials and plants and being client oriented and things like that. So I think we do have there is a worldview potentially. I actually think also most landscape architects inherently have like a great love of nature.
This is what I'm wondering. Like if you've studied these things and you've become aware, or maybe you always had a love for nature, but you become aware of kind of how interconnected things are, that would lead you to, I don't know, think about other things a certain way. I mean, you must have a care for the climate. I don't know. Are there landscape architects who like don't believe in climate change, or landscape architects who think
Probably
like,
in the Midwest,
don't,
not in LA.
don't care about native whatever and just let's do whatever we want.
I think there will always be bad practitioners in any profession. That's just unavoidable. But I would like to think that I would say like a inherent like love of nature is probably a common thread with most landscape architects, but there's probably some evil ones floating around there somewhere too. There's always rotten eggs, you know?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just interesting to me because as soon as you deal with plants and nature and these things, then you're directly tied to other questions. This is the recurring theme of this conversation, I suppose, that just you don't have to answer when you're dealing with like walls and stuff. You know what I mean? The environmental concerns and therefore the other ones, they don't have to be there. If as an architect I choose to ignore them, I can. But I don't know how you would, huh?
In a way.
In a way, I mean, yeah, it's not good. It catches up to all of us. But in the landscape realm, I can't imagine that it's you can easily kind of ignore these issues because there's what you deal with.
You can, and also a garden is a very different thing than a building. I think a building, after you build it, there's going to be some sort of like post-occupational like review of the building system or whatever it is, but it tends to be a thing that changes less than a landscape. So when we're done with the project, the thing is just getting started, and so we have to have like this like long view, and we're actually starting to change the way we write proposals because we're realizing that it's ineffective for us to like finish the project and then say like goodbye. And so on the projects that for clients we like, I'm kidding, but on all of our projects we're trying to instill some sort of like long-term maintenance thing because we don't take pictures for at least a year. And really the garden starts getting good like 3 years in. So what we're trying to do is like as an office, structure the proposals and our relationships with our clients in kind of like this long view. Because landscape is more of a long game than architecture. I think maybe that's a little mean because I do think a building changes, and especially like public buildings have these lives and patterns of their own. But
I get what you're saying. Yeah, totally.
Do you design a garden thinking like, okay, I'm going to design it for the next 20, 30 years? Or is it more to like the stage that you think he would reach within the next 3 years and then kind of maintaining that way?
It's a balancing act between gardening the garden for 30 years and spacing out plants. A lot of this comes out to like distances of plantings, right? Because a thing is this big when you put it in the ground and it can be 20 feet later. But it's a balancing act between the long view of the garden and also making sure the client is satisfied at day one as well. So it's a balancing act. And more, I'm trying to be upfront with clients and say, like, things are going to be small on day one, and you're going to see a lot of mulch, and you're going to, and then I'll see you in 6 months. And you come back in 6 months, and the thing is fundamentally changed. And usually they're happy, you know. So it's balancing that day of install kind of expectation with this is actually a 30-year project sort of a thing.
Right.
And is it better to plant the plant at a smaller size and let them develop on site, or can you just buy a big tree or big plants already grown and just replant them?
It depends on the species. I would say that native species, if in the long term, are better to plant small. Like really, there's no sense in planting native species. I hate to say this, but it's more logical to plant a native species from a 1-gallon container size, simply because it will establish better. When a thing is young, the same thing works for people, I think. It's more impressionable and adaptable to change. The older a thing gets, like the less likely it's going to want to move. That said, I also plant giant trees in boxes all the time too. So that happens. It kind of depends on the condition and the context.
It's very interesting. You know, when you were saying that for the design process, like generically one of the first things you do is you have different schemes, you sit down, everyone talks, and I presume you sit down with your team too and everyone kind of shares ideas. God damn it, I lost my question again. something about this room that makes me forget a question every time we're interviewing here. I don't know what it is.
Is it the dullness?
That's
nothing against the room, but
no, I guess that's beyond fair. Yeah, it might be that. Shit.
Were you heading towards like concepts?
Like the design process.
Concept design process.
Like we use 3D models, you know, when we start talking about volumetry of the buildings and things like that. You guys probably, I don't know, start in plan and using colors, patterns. Like, how do we
start? So one of the reasons Alan and I wanted to start Terremoto is we wanted to create a landscape architectural office that built conceptually driven projects. That is something that, I don't mean to sound fancy, it's not a thing that most landscape architecture offices do.
Is that something that happens in school though, and then doesn't happen in practice?
It happens more in school and it happens less in practice, but I don't think monolithically so. Sure. We wanted to create projects that were about ideas and kind of exploring notions of culture, and gardens being like these little cultural expressions, which historically they have been, and I think they still are, but I think Terremoto is a little bit more explicit about that fact. So early days, I always say early days, we tried to do this thing where we would start the project and we'd be like, okay, what's the project? What's this? What's our philosophy? What's our concept? What's our thing? And then as time went by, we realized sometimes you do know actually early on, like, let's do this thing. But then sometimes you don't, and you just have to start. So I've become much more like kind of flexible and soft about the fact that the conceptual narrative or like the philosophical exploration of a Terremoto project will happen, but I never know quite when now. Sometimes you get to a site and it's like, oh, there's an existing towering stand of redwoods and there's a creek and it just hits you. Like, so we're going to do this thing that kind of references the existing conditions or whatever it is. And then there were projects where it just didn't come to you. And then I'd realize that sometimes it'll hit you midway and sometimes you have to finish the damn thing and then look back at it and be like, oh, that's kind of what we were doing.
Really?
Yeah. And so we try to have these conversations throughout the project, like figuring out like what the conceptual narrative is. But oftentimes it's like a unfinished page in our presentation that we like keep in the presentation and we like noodle on the thing and kind of like let it evolve naturally. Because I used to try and hammer out the concept.
Sure.
And I came to a point where I realized that wasn't necessarily successful. That page
evolves throughout the timeline of the project.
Yeah.
Huh.
Like on our Marin Ship Studios project, I kind of knew the concept early on because we were designing a kit of parts, and so it was kind of the concept of the project was that we want to treat the site like a meditation Japanese garden, and that will evolve, and so that there was clarity to that one, and we kind of like knew it right away. We're working on a project like on this crazy hillside in Mount Washington, and right now, and we're only realizing, I think that this is what this project is about. This project is about like letting go and letting the builder, giving the builder like a little bit of information and a little bit of direction and then walking away. Because there's also, this project is about, we're working with like these awesome like Latino guys who have their own kind of aesthetic predilections and their kind of way of doing things. And so that project we're doing in Mount Washington on this little hillside is kind of an exercise in letting like the clarity and like the strength of the worker. So that's totally conceptually like two totally different things, but like, yeah, so.
Right.
Just trying to remain open, like keep our minds open to all these different like threads of information or patterns.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing because I think, I remember my question now that you...
Sorry, I drifted.
No. It's totally tied to this because I think a lot of times in the design process, like the concept or narrative is the through line, and it's used as the thing that you try to keep consistent. And it evolves and changes, but it's the thing that stays
the guide.
This is the guide. And you produce options, you do things, you kind of test against that, and maybe the thing needs to, again, evolve a little bit, or the option you created needs to more fit this guide that you've created. I don't mean guide as in a template, but
Mm-hmm.
No,
I know
but
what you're
yeah.
saying.
Yeah.
But it helps you validate your ideas,
Right.
right?
And
So
that's
everything makes
sometimes
sense.
it's not enough.
Totally, but that's kind of the most ideal form,
Right.
actually, when it exists early. But sometimes you have to start, and you don't know what it is. So,
Do you ever wonder though? So the question that I had was, ideally, right? You have this very clear narrative. It's been written down, right, and everyone understands it, and you test against that. But also in the process of being more open, which is kind of what you're talking about. Is there ever concern about you placing kind of your stamp on the project, or making sure that it? I guess this gets to quality control too in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe like what is it that you do to make sure that you're achieving, I don't know, consistency throughout all of the work, or the quality or something? Is it right?
That's a good question. It's a tough question.
Because certainly for the
are you meaning kind of like what makes it a Terremoto project?
I suppose. I mean, I think so. For the partners who just do a sketch and then
Yeah.
everyone else executes, like it's very clear. It's easy. They can answer the question easily. It's because I sketch it and they do what I say. That's how I achieve this consistency, quality, and also how I know that I'm having enough presence in it, and they're this kind of thing. But for a process that's not that authoritarian, I've always wondered, how do you know, kind of, I don't know, where the guiding principles are?
Mm-hmm. I don't know the answer to that question.
I
guess, what makes a Terremoto project a Terremoto project? I think it would be that it will ultimately be grounded in some sort of philosophical narrative about what it is we're trying to do, and in turn, I mean, I guess our projects are attempts at, ultimately, as all expressions of culture are just trying to figure out what it means to be human, right? And I think that relates to art, architecture, all these things. That's kind of, we're all trying to figure that out. And I guess I would say our projects, we're trying to figure that out, what it means to be a human, and have an impact, however large or small, on like land, if that makes sense.
So then, almost regardless of the size, the physical size of the project, do you consciously say, okay, we need to make sure we have this philosophical narrative, and it needs to be, the project needs to be thought about, let's say at the immediate scale of the client, you know, how they're going to relate to it, but then also the broader one of the city, and even the broader one of another
region.
narrative? Yeah. So are you kind of, for each project, always thinking about these different kind of levels, so to speak? Like, is that the ideal thing, to be able to have the different modes of thought, from big to small inside of the thing?
We are. Landscape architecture is unavoidably regional, basically, in a way that architecture is almost more free from context, or it can be irreverent in a way that I can't put a plant in the ground that's going to die, fundamentally. Right. So as it relates to planting, what our practice is inevitably an expression of, at least as it relates to botany, is inevitably an expression of like regional characteristics. And again, this is kind of where native plants get like also layering that in constantly, which is what we do, is an expression of that as well. Alan and I do our best to be critical regionalists as we can, which is kind of in that both through horticulture and also the materials that we use, we're believers in using things that come from nearby. That's not always necessarily super possible. We tried to do this thing at our platform project, where a kind of sly secret subtext to the project is we tried to get the materials to come, all the materials on the project we tried to get to come from within 100 miles of the project site. Things, that gets very vague when you get into planting, because sure, a plant perhaps grew from seed in Topanga, but this plant is actually from Madagascar. Sure. So it gets complex, like really immediately. But we are believers, like in region, when we can, we like to use redwood and cedar because it's coming from Washington or Canada or these things. We do have to break these rules sometimes too, and because a client will insist on a tropical hardwood, which is kind of savage and tough for us, but we are also a client-based profession too. So we do our best to live by this code, but also we have to sometimes do right by our clients as well. So it's kind of finding that balance and navigating that. Yeah.
Is it important for the projects in your office to communicate to the client and maybe even the general public the different understandings and levels of success of the project? So like the 100-mile radius thing could be an example, I suppose. Like, is it important that the client understand that that's part of it, or is it good enough for them to love the project for their own reasons, and that's kind of it?
It depends on the client. Sometimes we'll have people seek us out for the narrative and for that thing, and then sometimes we have people who are completely uninterested. So then then it becomes more of an internal exercise. So sometimes we'll take clients along for that ride, and sometimes we don't, and that's fine. It depends on if they're interested, kind of, which is what you said. Now, I think we do have clients who seek us out because we do that thing that a lot of people don't do. I think the narratives on our website, it's been a slow burn, but now we get sought after by sophisticated clients, which is lovely. So yeah, to that end, those conceptual wanderings that we do are good for us, and slowly it's starting to be a part of our brand. I don't like the word brand, but part of our brand. You know what I mean?
Brand's it's been overused, but it's also, there's no other word to substitute for brand. So.
Shtick. It's not a stick.
That's worse.
Yeah, way worse.
So you guys have been around for 5.5 years or so, right? At what point did you feel like you guys turned the corner to where you were stable, work was coming in, you've maybe got a routine, or there's a flow in the office of how things work and the culture and everything?
It probably took 2.5 years. We hired Diego. He was our first employee. And once he was on, it started to click. He still is, one of the backbones of our office, and he's a production powerhouse as well as a very talented designer. But then, when he was on, and then I was able to kind of focus on kind of chasing down projects and doing that sort of a thing. So probably it took about 2.5 years. But still, in a small business, money is just like a sine wave. There's months where we're super busy, but we'll have no money, and it's very confusing to me. And actually, to be honest, I would say that opening an office in both places worked to our advantage in that way. In that, especially in Los Angeles, there was a void for landscape architecture. A small landscape architecture office that just a lot of them really didn't exist, who would do residential as well. So we got busy fast down here, simply because it was a good business decision. Let's open a practice in a place where there's not a lot of other people doing that thing that we do. Not to say that I haven't been working super hard for a really long time and I'm exhausted and all that, because I am, but it's clicking now. We're the office is at a really beautiful point right now. I'm very grateful for that. So,
well, this has been really interesting, and I think that's a really great story and way to end it. This was a really fascinating conversation, and obviously you're crazy busy, so really appreciate you coming out and having a chat with us.
Thank you for doing what you do. Since I discovered your website, I've been listening to it. Your podcast. I've been listening to it nonstop. It's wonderful.
There's some good ones, and there's some ones that are a little risky, I think. We take risks.
I haven't done the Avengers one yet.
That one's more sane. I mean, it's about the Avengers movie, so if you're interested in that, then that's so.
I am actually. That's my secret thing, is that
really.
I once my kids are asleep and everyone's asleep, I go watch shitty action movies and have a beer just to stay sane. My wife's always like, "You just watch garbage," and I'm like, "I know, but I need that." But Avengers is, anyways, we won't get into it. It's a good movie.
It's a good movie.
It's dense.
Did you see the second one?
I did. I've seen all of them. Yeah. Talk about expressions of culture. It's a funny thing when an expression of culture is manifest in a big Hollywood action movie, you know what I mean? But then actually there's a lot of cultural information there. So
that's it was a beast of a film, and I don't even know how they do something like that, because there's so many people involved, and it still boggles my mind when you see the behind the scenes footage and it's just a big green wall and two dudes in spandex, and then you see the movie, it's like, what exactly happened between this behind the scenes and the final thing? I don't understand it.
Yeah.
But anyway, this was super awesome, and hopefully in the future we'll have you on again. And
Great.
I
love that. Thank you for all of it.
Cheers. Okay, we hope you enjoyed that conversation, and hit us up via our hotline 213-222-6950 if you have any more questions for us, comments for us, people we should have on. What did you think of this conversation with David Godshall? I thought it was pretty fucking good. He's really interesting, and he's nice and honest. He's like the perfect guest,
All right,
really.
Stop falling in love. You're already taken, okay? Like, he's not interested in you.
He might be free, though. I don't know.
And while we're at it, as always, please leave us a review. That will truly mean a lot to us to know what you think of this show, as well as supporting us to keep going on and on further. To do that, you can use the iTunes app with the podcast and leave your review on your iPhone, on your desktop.
That is incorrect information. It's not the iTunes app. There is no iTunes app for the iPhone.
iTunes.
There's simply music and there's podcasts.
Whatever, you know what you're listening onto. If you don't have an iPhone or a Mac, you can download the desktop version of iTunes and leave a review there. If you're not in the US and you are leaving us a review on iTunes, we won't be able to see it. So please make sure you take a screenshot of it and either email it to us or send it to us on Instagram, on Facebook, anywhere that you can, so we can see, what you think of the show.
And we can't see it because Apple does this weird thing where there's different websites per country for podcasts. So that's that. We're on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube on occasion. This one was on YouTube. But, we're not always on YouTube because video takes a lot of time and money. So we don't do that as often. We don't do it for all the episodes.
It's mostly because you don't look good every day. So.
No one looks good every day. Right?
I do.
Except for what else is going on? We hope to keep this going, and
stay tuned about the interview episode coming out.
The interview episode is coming out basically in 2 days. If you didn't get your questions in, that's too bad. Listen to it, and but if anything comes up as a result of that podcast that we did not answer, then let us know. Or if you have advice that you'd like to share, let us know too. Yawning on the show. Okay, this is it. This is the end of the end, right? Good? Okay, good. Thanks everyone for listening, and we will talk to you again next week or sooner. Bye.
Bye-bye.